want to thank Mike and Cordelia for all of the help with, first of all, for inviting me. And secondly, for all of the help with preparing and getting us on the right track so that we could be together today. So I am going to share my screen. And the first thing that I want to share with you today is I have had the pleasure of making change and enabling change a really big part of my life's work and my career. And so I have a heart for everything that we're talking about today. And it's very much up off the pages of methodology. Each thing that I'm talking to you about today has been a part of lived experiences, helping clients through it, navigating this as a part of my own journey. So I am really looking forward to a robust conversation. I want to invite you to share your questions. I will leave room towards the end to do that, but if there's a burning question that you have, certainly do feel free to put that in the chat or acknowledge in the room, and I'll ask for Cordelia or Mike to give me a signal if we need to pause. But with that, I will go ahead and dive us in. So I will ask questions of this nature, and I invite you to think of this yourself or feel free to put it out there. But when you hear the word change, what's the first word that comes to mind for you?
Okay, try again. Sorry, we're all muted. Go ahead, go.
Oh, are we all muted? Okay, well, how about this? Think of the first word that comes to mind when you hear the word change. And I'm going to share a few and see if they resonate with what you were thinking. Turnover, new, resistance, adaptation. I think a lot of times whenever I ask this question in workshops and the more extensive exploration of this work, a lot of the words initially are fear-based or negative, but change also opens up huge opportunities. Innovation cannot happen without change. New opportunities and the terrain of a next leg of a journey cannot happen without change. So there's lots of opportunity available to us with this work as well. So what I want to share with you today, I have two objectives and I hope they align with yours. I want to offer some insights that will help expand understanding of the nature of change and also our human response to it. There's a lot of study around just the human response to change. And I also want to share some proven tools that'll help us navigate and lead change. So it's a fair amount to cover in 40 minutes, but I'm excited about the opportunity to do that. So the three things that we will dive into is we will talk about the nature and the stages of change. And I invite you to think about it relative to any sort of change. Yes, work, yes, career, yes, in our businesses, but also life. As Mike mentioned, COVID is creating a new sense for so many dimensions of our lives. So everything that we're talking about applies, whether it's I want to get healthy, I want to read more, I want to prepare for a job change, whatever those things may be, as well as it's my company and I'm implementing a new tool. We need to redesign our organization. We need to encourage people to come back into the office. So all of those things follow a similar sort of pathway, and we'll talk about that. The second thing that we'll discuss is how we respond to change. We all bring our human selves to work. And as much as we tell ourselves we can compartmentalize, we bring our human selves, and our human selves follow a similar pattern when we're navigating change. And so we'll talk about that a bit. And then lastly, I could not spend this time with you without sharing some levers that you can engage as leaders as you're navigating change and inviting your employees and your teams to do so. So as we dive in, I want to encourage you to think of a particular change that you're either experiencing or thinking about. Because as much as I love diving into the theory and the conceptual aspects of this work, it's all about anchoring it in the real and the reality of what we're living. So if you have that change in mind, I want you to bump everything that we talk about today up against that and sort of ask yourself, okay, yeah, how does that apply to this particular change? So I know that we're talking about this notion of navigation. So I'm going to keep it in line and anchor this in reality. So we're going to start with the nature of change. All change every aspect of a change follows a predictable sort of stage. We rarely think of change in this way. A lot of times we think of it as a before, during, after, or we simply think we flip a switch, but we all know that change is not limited to that. So there's this notion called ADKAR that is rooted in an exploration of how we can be intentional about what we do and how we approach change based on those stages. One of my favorite aspects of what I do is helping folks be as intentional about how they do what they do as they are about what they choose to do. So if you think about a change, and I invited each of you to sort of think about a particular one, remember that there's often a stage of pre-contemplation. Pre-contemplation sounds like one of those ethereal sort of words, but all that is you may not know that you're about to make a change, but you know that some aspect of the status quo is not working. That, believe it or not, that is a part of the change story because some part of you is preparing to unlock the status quo. And when you're in that stage, it is all about being vocal that something is not working. What I have found over a 25+ year career is there can be a tendency to sort of hold some of that close to the vest because, you know, for all the reasons, and we know that there are some times that there are changes that we can't talk about, but we can talk about the fact that the status quo is not working. We're not hitting those numbers. We haven't hit those for the last couple of quarters. So something needs to happen. So a little bit of this is being vocal about the status quo not working. The next stage of change is around contemplation. And this is, hey, we're aware that something is not working. We know we need to make a change. Now let's ensure that we're bringing folks along on the journey to say, we're taking status quo off the table. Something's going to shift. Because in the absence of that conversation, status quo feels like it's going to remain an option when we know that it's not. And some of this is rooted in some work that I've been doing over the years in this study of what I call neutrality being a myth. If you're not moving forward, some aspect of what's happening is regression. So if we can take staying the same off the table, then we are all sort of putting our heads and hearts in service of where we're going to go next. In this next stage, preparation, this is all about helping folks prepare. Is it a new technical skill that I need to learn? We may not have made the change yet, but how do I help prepare folks that are involved in this, are going to be impacted so that I'm bringing them along or inviting them along on the journey with me. And then finally, you're taking action. This is what I call going into the lab. If you are introducing a change, know that it's rare that you're going to be fully adapted to it on day one. So it's sort of trial and error. What's working well? I think when we introduce a change, especially if it's technology related, everybody's sort of ready to get across the finish line and they flip that switch and it's like, whew, we are done. But sometimes that's the start of the story because people need to try it out, learn, and try again. I'm going to move my screen here so I can see. And then this next stage is all about maintenance. This is weaving this change into the fabric of how you work. So how are you reinforcing it so that it's no longer that project that we did back in 2021? It's now a new way of working. So that's integration into processes and sharing experiences openly about what's working and what's working well. And so what I wanted to share with you in this particular topic is the fact that change is not just this one single flip a switch and we're done. There's a lot of opportunity for communication engagement along the way, before, up to, during, and after the change. So the next topic that I want to share with you is how we respond to change. And this is always an interesting conversation because just like there's no crying in baseball, it's tough when you start bringing emotion related words into work. But again, remember, we bring our human selves. So you'll see some words that feel emotional, but it's, and we may not name them in this way in work, but I invite you to think about in the context of that change that you're looking at, or even a change you've experienced in the past, think about each of these stages. So what we're going to walk through really quickly here is the change curve. And a little bit of the lay of the land here before we build is when you're introducing change, there, the axis here is performance over time. So when you're first, remember we mentioned in the initial change stage, there can be some shock or sudden awareness that something needs to change. And it can be shocking. It can be discombobulating. And so we have to lean into that and acknowledge that this is what people are going through. Once that introduction is there, some things that can happen, and again, this feels hypothetical, but sometimes there can be denial. Like, you know, the numbers will be fine. It's been, we've missed them the last 3 quarters, but you know, it's a dip. This is predictable. It's okay. We'll be fine. Sometimes it can just be, oh my God, we'll never hit those again. So there can be some dips in performance in these earlier stages because it's so different from what's been going on. In this next stage, there can also be some blaming. Whose fault is it? We live in a society where we first want to know sometimes who's at fault when, yes, that has some point of that's a data point, but staying there has not moved the needle, right? So when you see this happening, know that it's a natural thing that's a part of the journey. What can also then happen is some degree of insecurity. Depression is a big word, but there can be a low point because so much of our, in Western society, sometimes our work can be a part of our identity. And when we are making a major change, you're unlocking some part of what that person knew to be a big part of themselves. So we have to acknowledge that people may experience a dip. And that is the lowest point sort of in this, but thankfully the curve can swing back up over time. And the way that we do that is through learning and discovery. Acknowledge, a person will ultimately acknowledge that the change is happening. They'll, once they have the awareness of what the new expectations are and feel a part of the process, they'll do some experimentation. That's where the optimism and the hope can start coming in. And as leaders, we just, if we anticipate this, we can sort of meet folks where they are along this journey. And then ultimately, when the feelings of satisfaction and acknowledgement come into play, that's when you have some new meaning that can be integrated into this process. So again, this is the path that people are following when they are impacted by a change. Largely, I'm going to say this is commonly referred to when a person didn't have a choice, the change was thrust upon them. But I'd say we follow this regardless, even if it is something that we initiate. All right, so a couple of other things about this change curve just before we talk about the last topic. Individuals can be at different points along the curve. If you're a leader and your leadership team has been thinking about this for a long time and then you start introducing it, those folks that are hearing the first time, they're starting back at the beginning, and you may already be at the point of readiness for integration. The pace that one moves can vary depending on the degree of impact, as well as all the other things that are going on in life. When you are planning the change and you have the opportunity to be one of the people at the table, sort of moving the levers, know that what can feel like a wrap up because, hey, we went live, it can feel like an end for you. It's a beginning for someone else when they're just learning of it. And sometimes simply acknowledging that there is a pathway or a curve can help folks open up lines of communication around navigating change. And then finally, communication is going to be the lifeblood of everything that we're talking about. And sometimes that communication is, we don't have that answer now, but we're committed to finding it. As a matter of fact, we invite you to be a part of developing it. So communication is a big part of the engagement process here. I would be remiss in talking about change if I did not acknowledge change resistance, because a number of people may have heard, and how many of us have heard, oh, people resist change. That's just how we're wired. And the answer to that is that yes, they can, but not all do. Some people are first movers and they're hungry for change. But let's talk about why people may resist. One, there can be a fear that the change will mean personal loss. Whether it's security, wait a minute, I used to be the person that they went to for that old way of working. Who am I if I'm no longer that? And we're doing it a different way. Sometimes it's because they did not have any input into the change. So your frontline folks that are living the engagement with your clients, they have some of the best insight about how change can happen. And so sometimes it's tough to really buy into change when you feel like it's thrust upon you. I usually put in an example here from when I was an RA at the University of Alabama, and so we'll talk about that sometimes when we have a little bit more time. But ultimately, people, it's hard to throw stones at something that you had a hand in building. When folks are surprised that and it's not a change that they can impact, it's sort of, hey, this is the new way. There are no questions. That's a tough place to be, and sometimes people have a natural tendency to resist or push back on that. Sometimes when a person feels kept out of the loop on purpose, or it feels like manipulation, and they felt like something was kept a secret. So how we introduce change and how we navigate it all play a role here. And then ultimately, if they think the change will not succeed, how many of us have been in business environments or even in life where they're like, we've tried that before. If I just bide my time, we're going to go back to the old way anyway. So sometimes there can be resistance in that way. So we're now going to enter into this last stage, and then I'm going to remove the slides and open up for any questions. But ultimately, we want to talk about what are the levers that we can use to navigate change. And I use the word navigate versus some of the traditional terms like management or change management, because navigation gives us room to respond and adjust. You're actively engaging. It's not just about flipping a switch and a switch and going live. We're going to put this out here. We're going to listen. We're going to learn, and we're going to adjust where we can. So the levers themselves, we try to use really accessible language here. So rather than sort of jargon, but ultimately is this first one, we start here, make the case. How often do we hear about a change, but we don't know why? And one of my favorite questions to ask when we're making the case is, what happens if we don't? Because again, if we can unlock that belief that status quo is possible, then we can help folks understand that change is imminent. Let's be intentional about how we're going to do it. After you have made the case for the change, define the vision. Acknowledge that, hey, there's a new way that we're going to be engaging here. Let's define our vision for what that looks like in our approach to it. Communicate, and listen. A lot of times when we think about communication, we think about what we're saying, but one of the most important tools is listening and making sure that your communication plans have active roads to hear as well. This next one is so important, removing barriers. Once you have launched a change, listen, engage, find out what's hard, and be intentional as leaders about removing that so that folks can continue on that journey. Make sure that you're setting milestones. When we used to go to the mall, we always had that kiosk that said, you are here. And that's such an important thing so that people are grounded in the pathway. Let's celebrate and acknowledge how far we've come and be really clear about how far we need to go. And then finally, reinforcing the change is so important because again, it keeps it from being this mere project that we did that one time, and you're actually integrating it into new ways of being and working. So I know we've covered, and I've tried to be expedient in covering these terms, but I want to open up the floor. I know we're all muted, but if you have a question, feel free to raise that or put it in the chat. Cordelia, do we have any questions that have been shared at this point?
We don't, but we're unmuted in the room, and I think the participants online can just unmute themselves. If
Okay.
you can't, just put in the chat. I'm monitoring the chat also, so I can say out loud if we can't.
Okay. All right. Is there any question before we round the bend here that I can answer?
I have a question.
Yes.
I have a question. The very beginning of this process, I'm working with a client who acknowledges he has problems. I've forwarded many assets to him, whether it's a fractional CFO, bankers to help him through. He's in a tight cash flow situation. He can't seem to change. He can't seem to, even though he acknowledges there's an issue. So do you have any examples that you can provide where someone they just can't, small to mid-sized CEOs, they've come up through controlling everything. I mean, do you have any war stories that you could share that might be good examples of how you move somebody forward?
I appreciate that question. Thank you so much. And yes, I do have war stories of my own experience in working with clients. And what I do in that moment, if we've shared tools or assets or acknowledged, I sometimes just pause for a minute and have a conversation about what's going on, what's the story we're telling ourselves about it, and what happens if we don't change. And sometimes that shift alone will at least unlock a little bit of breathing room to say, again, status quo is not okay. We're taking that off the table. So if we don't change, let's fast forward this a little bit. Is that next stage of what's possible with no change? Is that where you want to be? And sometimes also we look at the other side of that coin to say, what part, especially working with entrepreneurs, business owners, what part of your business most needs you? And where is there an opportunity for someone else if you were to delegate and engage your team around helping you move forward? So in the long and short of it is, in that situation, especially when I'm coaching an individual, it's really just pause and acknowledging that, inaction is not an option. So what is it that you ultimately want, and which action moves you in the right direction towards that? Does that help?
So scare the heck out of them.
We call it the velvet 2x4. No, but no.
Nice. I like that.
But honestly, as business owners, we are. It's so important that we take a moment to, have those hard conversations. And it doesn't have to be as scary as it feels. It's just, we're just acknowledging a truth. But at the end of the day, we're both on the same side of the table looking at the situation and looking for opportunities there.
Hey, Scott, sounds like a great candidate for flexible.
I can get him here.
Indeed. Thank you for the question.
Teacher, I have a question. You talked about, and I love status quo is off the table.
Yeah.
So now I'm going to piggyback on Scott's. So now let them to agree. What I find most people stay stuck is that planning. Like they just over plan, and never get to that execution stage, right? Like, how do you navigate that part of the stage?
Ooh, you guys have great questions. We do a couple of things. The whole analysis paralysis piece comes to mind when you're saying that. I actually really talk about experimentation and actually help clients do that. Yes, you may have this big gnarly plan, but let's actually break this up to work.
I'm trying to get it off, Jan. I can't figure out how to do it.
Uh-oh.
I can't get my Zoom back.
I think there's someone else is weighing in, but ultimately with analysis paralysis, we try to break that plan up and say, within this next quarter, what are 2 things we can move forward with so that we can put it out there in the lab, get a response to it, and adjust and adapt and learn? Because the analysis paralysis does one thing. It helps us sort of hold on to the status quo longer than probably we need to. So my approach that comes to mind as I consider your question is breaking it apart. Use words like experimentation. Let's actually put it out there, allow people to chew on it, get some feedback to inform the next stage so that we're not sort of holding on too long. Does that help?
Yes, great.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
You know what always strikes me as very helpful in that instance is the phrase, not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Some people refer to the 80-20 rule and the this. A lot of times I use the words like experimentation in those scenarios, like in that example about perfect being the enemy of good, is I don't want my voice to be the only one weighing in on this. And how do I do that? I can put it out here so that we can breathe some air into it, allow people to respond, see what we're thinking. And there's nothing that says we can't learn from that and adjust. It doesn't mean that, oh my gosh, it's wrong if it didn't land the way that we want it to. That's actually learning. Any others? These are great. Okay, Larry. Hi, Larry.
Hey, Deidre, and thanks for inviting me to participate. So I'm a self-professed Deidre groupie, and wanted the opportunity to listen in. One of the questions, and you and I may have actually talked about this before, Deidre, but one of the things that we are looking at are KPIs as it relates to the change itself, and would love to get your perspective in terms of being able to track the effect and the impact of the change through those KPIs, and then how that should be aligned or connected to the overall organization's KPIs.
Ah, wonderful. I love the integration of KPI and ROI into this discussion. A lot of what I look to is when I'm working in corporate environments, especially if someone's making an investment, multi-million-dollar investment, there is a business case that was made that got that funding approved. So let's look at that and say, how are we tracking to realizing those goals? Especially when you're looking at something like a technology investment, it's really tempting for success to be, whoo, we went live and it is in. We got across the finish line, but that is not why the funds got improved. It is because we're going to know something or now have some level of visibility to something we didn't before. We're now going to be more efficient as indicated by these. So to your point about the alignment, I look at the organization, the department that functions goals and say, how does this change move the needle? And then track the evolution of it during and after the change, Larry. And it's so important to keep that as a part of the conversation throughout the process and make sure that it is as present as the whole the progression of the change itself. Does that help?
Yeah, great, thank you.
Thank you for the question, I appreciate it. All right, any others?
I actually have a question.
Yes.
So I do a lot of measurement work in my work. Okay, I do a lot of measurement, survey measurement, and other sources of data. I guess the question is, can you talk a little bit more about how your own personal experience about how weaving in measurement, key performance indicators can actually be used to facilitate the process towards better objectives. Like, for example, setting targets going to key performance indicators, interim targets. I'm just wondering, can you talk a little bit more about your experience in that space?
Sure.
Because part of the deal with is you can get too regimented. You get too, in some respects, you get too wrapped up if in the measurement piece, at least in my experience, and sort of lose sight of the forest and trees. So I'm just wondering if you have any experience along those lines.
Sure. Well, a couple of things come to mind. One is when you're first launching the change, being mindful, if you remember with the change curve, there's going to be, or there is a very real possibility that a performance dip can happen. If that is indeed the case, acknowledge that and be mindful of it and mitigate that risk. A big part, change management, if you will, or change navigation can often be relegated to sending out some emails. Hey, we communicated, that's great. But actually done well, it's an integrated part of how you manage the project itself. And a big part of that is upfront saying, what are the things that we're going to measure that help us understand not only whether this, what our return on investment is, but also how are we making progress? How much are we engaging folks? And so when it comes to the KPI measurement up front, it's important to identify what those are. I try to keep it very simple, and it's not about, just like tried and true KPI expectations, it's not about measuring 30 things. It's about what are the 5 things that are going to give us the indicators of health for our business, our function, and this particular change. And with each status, we're actually talking through them. An example of some KPI are, if we're changing out the tool that folks use for, I don't know, running certain reports or getting data, you have to also be mindful of how are you going to make the shift so that you don't overly impact those who need the output, who depend on that output. So some of it is hearing from the folks impacted by the change, and making sure that you mitigate any risk, you minimize disruption where you can, and acknowledge an expectation of a dip, and set timing expectations for when that dip will likely kind of be back on the upswing. So it really depends. And I'd love to talk to you more about the specific example, but I advise folks, don't be afraid of keeping your data and KPI in the forefront of this. Anticipate what the impacts will be as you go, and then make adjustments along the way if the expectations don't match the reality.
Deirdre, we have one question from Susan, and then I think we need to go on to finish, and then we have the questions at the end. Susan asks, could you share some leadership characteristics of the best leaders of change?
Thank you so much for the question, Susan. One characteristic that is really important is the willingness to listen, and a willingness to be vulnerable and acknowledge when they don't know an answer, but a commitment to getting it. Sometimes we talk a lot of times in business about transparency. Transparency is often misunderstood as, oh, well, I have to be able to say everything. No, it's about acknowledging when you can say something and acknowledging when you can't, and share what you can. So a willingness to be communicative and sort of engage and listen and ask questions, that's a really big part of it. Someone who can bring the energy to folks when they're navigating that change curve that we talked about. So flexibility, listening, vulnerability, and someone who is willing to sort of get in the trenches with folks and understand that they too are going through their own process, and acknowledge that with folks. So a willingness to share their own experiences.
So Deirdre, do you want to do more slides, or do you want to just do more Q&A?
No, I had one more that I was going to share, but I wanted to just visit this really quickly. And that is, these are the 3 things that we've touched on today. And I welcome any questions that you have as a follow-up. I have an exercise that I do that sort of walks through these levers in practice. So again, I can talk this stuff all day, but I want to be mindful of time. So more than anything, I want to stop and say thank you for your questions and for listening, and for me allowing me to join you today.
Right. Did you have one comment about that leadership? I think a great leader rewards change. People will take change, and rewards those that are willing to go do it, and builds culture of change. I come from an environment that we build giant prototypes. Every day is change. We love change, and we thrive by it because that creates our innovation. And that culture is something that is ongoing. So change is just part of what we do.
Yeah, and integrated into the culture. Yeah.
Yep. Awesome.
All right, well, thank you so much for having me. I'm mindful that I'm handing things back over to Cordelia and to Mike. And I hope that everyone has a good rest of your day. Thank you again.
Hold on one second. We're changing right now. All right. Back of the room. All right.
Stop at the end. Okay, you're good. It's kind of weird, but.
Where am I looking though?
Look at
Right.
There you
But I'm
go.
left, I'm right. There we go. Oh, there's the camera. All right. Deirdra, thank you very much. That was outstanding. And we do appreciate you presenting to us today. And just another reminder as we wrap up today about our next month's meeting at the Ron Clark Academy. Let's make this really a special event and a special celebration for Sion and all that we've done with the foundation this past year. And I'm looking forward to seeing you all face to face at that meeting, right? So hopefully we'll get a chance to see everybody there. And y'all have a great day. Thank you for coming out today. We really appreciate it. Great meeting. Thanks, everybody.